Over the course of the 20th century, the people in the United States affected by mental illnesses, learning disabilities, or physical handicaps achieved progress toward their goals of equality and accommodations they require to live independently. They have emerged as a distinct social group, demonstrating to the United States that the disabled are anything but helpless. To understand the magnitude of this progress, it is important to understand the eugenics movement in the first decades of the 20th century. Eugenicists argued that the genetic features of the American population could be improved through forced sterilization and selective breeding, which violated the human rights of disabled Americans. In 1914, Harry Laughlin published the Model Eugenical Sterilization Law, which proposed to authorize the sterilization of those he referred to as the socially inadequate. The law listed physical and psychological conditions that constituted social inadequacy, including the, quote, feeble-minded, insane, criminalistic, epileptic, inebriate, diseased, blind, deaf, deformed, and dependent. At the time the law was published, 12 states had already enacted sterilization laws. By 1924, approximately 3,000 people had been involuntarily sterilized. In the court decision of Buck v. Bell, which upheld the court's right to forced sterilization, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. ruled, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." More than 60,000 Americans suffered involuntary sterilization procedures during the eugenics movement. The ruling of Buck v. Bell has not been overturned to this day. The disabled achieved significant progress when Franklin D. Roosevelt became President of the United States in 1932. Roosevelt, paralyzed by the polio virus, founded the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. The posters for the organization featured slogans about courage and hope, rather than depicting the disabled as poor genetic stock or an unwholesome element. This organization continues today as the March of Dimes. Perhaps even more significant were parts of Roosevelt's New Deal. The Social Security Act of 1935 included federally provided health insurance and wages for the disabled who were unable to work, granting them a limited measure of independence from state institutions and charity organizations. In addition to Roosevelt's efforts, the disabled also advocated for themselves. The disabled people of New York City accused Roosevelt's Work Progress Administration of stamping the applications of the physically handicapped, allegedly to remove them from consideration. After 2 lengthy sit-ins, the League of the Physically Handicapped ended their protests when the Work Progress Administration agreed to provide more than 1,500 jobs for the disabled in New York City. Less than a decade later, many veterans of World War II returned home disabled by injuries received while serving the United States. When they found that government buildings were not built to accommodate their limited mobility, the veterans began the barrier-free movement in 1950 and insisted that government buildings accommodate their disabled state. In response, 49 states passed legislation by 1973 requiring that churches and government buildings be handicap accessible. From the early 1950s through the early 1970s, we began to see the emergence of disabled people in America as a social group. However, the disabled lacked legal protections before Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This act was the first significant piece of legislation to protect disabled individuals from discrimination. Section 504 forbade exclusion from or denial of an equal opportunity to receive program benefits and services. This is the same protection that had been denied to disabled Americans when they were excluded from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Following 2 lower court rulings which argued that handicapped children had a right to, quote, free, appropriate public education, Congress passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, later renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Educational protections for children with disabilities were further improved in 1978 when the government established the National Council on Disability, or NCD, within the Department of Education. The NCD became an independent agency, and for the first time, those with disabilities had representatives in the national government advocating for their rights. The National Council on Disability representatives were also instrumental in passing the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which was signed into law by George H.W. Bush. The act was the first official legislation to provide disabled Americans with all of the protections outlined in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Disabled people in America continue to struggle against ableism, discrimination against the disabled in favor of people without disabilities. Recently, the West Virginia Disability Youth Caucus worked to ensure that newer generations know what disabled people have faced over the course of American history. Thanks to their efforts, West Virginia now requires schools to teach about the history of disability rights. There is also currently a movement known as Spread the Word to End the Word, founded in 2009, which seeks to remove the word retard from the English language. They claim that the word retard negatively stereotypes disabled people as a burden to society. Spread the Word to End the Word is a part of the continuing effort to prove disabled people's worth is separate from their disabilities.